And I'll turn it over to Tanna.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the Q&A as we go along. Um, I'll pause from time to time and take a look at it so that we can make sure we're answering questions that are helpful to your learning as you move through the session. I also love some participation for those interested, and you can go ahead and use the chat to participate. I can see both the chat and the Q&A, so feel free to chime in there, and I'll take a look, and hopefully we can keep this as interactive as possible without microphones on. You should have all of the slides that I'm going to share with you today. If for some reason you're missing a resource, just please let me know or let AbleNet know and we'll make sure that you get it. But I believe you've got a slide handout and you also have a Word document that has a handout about people play, which we'll talk about a little bit as we move through the session. All right. So we're talking today about how to bring AAC into the home for children under 5. So we're going to focus on early intervention environments, whether that be that you're working with families only in their home or maybe in a daycare setting or even in a preschool environment. So try to keep those flexible points in mind as we move through. I am going to spotlight the home, but we know that early intervention for these little ones is going to occur across different settings. And we want to make sure that we have AAC in mind across all of those settings. So if there's something that I mentioned that you can't figure out, how would I translate that into one of these other early intervention environments, please don't hesitate to ask or provide an example for us to chat through as a group. I might go a little bit over the hour today, but just know you're not required to stay. You're welcome to stay if I do go a little over time, but you can leave at the hour mark. And that will be fine. You can complete your quiz and your surveys as Jim let you know at the beginning. So a little bit about me for anyone who's interested in connecting. I am an SLP. I work in a couple different settings. One of them is early intervention here in the state of Colorado. So although I work with all ages, mostly with children and young adults who are non-speaking, who use AAC, I'm going to be using only my early intervention lens as we talk through today. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to connect and collaborate beyond today's training. I've offered lots of links here on the slide for you to do that through social media. And you can also access my email through these links as well. As you noticed when you signed up for this course, we have a couple goals that we're going to pinpoint today. At the very top of our hour, we're really going to identify at least 3 elements that we can consider when we're doing a family-centered parent-implemented AAC home program. So we know in early intervention, the idea, right, is we're giving our parents the wand that they need to do the work. And so our time with these families is really spent in more of a coaching role. And I'm hopeful that that will come across in our session today as well, that even when we're dealing with AAC, we're still trying to take a back seat in the direct intervention realm and really put the parent center stage with the child and coach them in a way that they can feel very confident and competent at building language with these technology tools. So we'll identify how we can create that AAC spin on our family-centered parent-implemented AAC home program. And then we're going to move through and try to think about some things we need to consider in order to help engineer the environments that these young kids are in and these families are living in. And so, as I said, we'll focus a lot on the home environment today, how to make that an immersive environment that has AAC tools at hand and AAC strategies in mind. But a lot of the things we talk about could very well apply to other early intervention environments. And then we'll round out by identifying some of those partner strategies. There's a lot of them, right, that we can teach our families. Some are just language intervention strategies, and others may be more AAC specific, but we're going to focus in on 3 to try to keep things a little more manageable for families juggling a lot in the home and really keep them more on the naturalistic side, which is, of course, at the core of what we do in our early intervention work. Before we get rolling, I do see that we've got a Q&A already, so I'm going to pop on over and just see if it's relevant to just that now, or if we want to pin it for later. Oh, it's not relevant to me. That's a Jim question, so I'm going to move on from that. All right, so we'll spend roughly about 30 to 45 minutes talking through our content, and then I will try to leave some time at the end for questions. But as I said, we'll move through the Q&A, and if you have a question, ask it, and I'll do my best to integrate it as we go along. All right, so let's start out right out of the gate. We're going to hit that learning objective number one, where we can take some of these principles here and integrate them into that family-centered parent-implemented home program. And so to lay this information out for you, I'm using here a framework that I created mostly to just organize information that's already out there. This isn't me reinventing the wheel. This is me just trying to give a bit of a system to what can feel like a pretty big snowball that you have to carry when you're thinking about not only how to integrate AAC for little kids when you're a therapist, but also how do I take that skill that I'm still maybe developing, and how do I hone in on my coaching ability so I can translate that skill to a parent who may not have the same background and experience that I do. So this Ready, Set, Go framework I've presented at other conferences. I'm going to give you a bit of an abbreviated version here. And I've also provided a link in your handout. As you can see, the image on the right-hand side, when you click on it on your handout, is going to take you to a PDF version of this document if you're interested in using it with the families that you support. We're going to walk through the framework itself, not the document right now, and kind of how we would integrate some of these ideas into creating a home program, knowing that it's going to be customized, right, based on where the family is in their learning process, where that parent is in their interaction dynamics with the child is often a lot of where we spend our time when we're coaching families. Just do this here. Okay, so when we think about creating that first step in our model here, that create, excuse me, that the create, we're going to use a couple items here, a couple ideas when we think about create. And the very first one is going to be the idea of getting prepared. And this seems kind of simple, but it's often overlooked in AAC work in general, and of course in EI work specifically. When we get prepared, that means that as a provider, I have to be really familiar with the child, or more importantly, in the EI setting, I have to make sure that the family or the primary caregivers are very familiar with the child's signals. They know that child. And oftentimes, caregivers are much better at this than we are because they spend every moment with this child. And so they can read them often much better than you and I. And so hopefully when you're coming to your coaching situation, you've already got this one nailed. You've got a caregiver that knows that child. They're taking a lot of time to be able to interpret the ways in which that child is already communicating. I don't know how many in the room had attended my previous talk earlier this month, but if you want a little bit more background on how you can yourself identify some of the signals that children are already using in order to set the stage for what you might model on AAC systems, I encourage you to head on over to that talk. It's on demand on AbleNet now. Um, and if you want the talk, you'll remember that we spent a lot of time thinking about how we can observe that child's non-linguistic, free-linguistic signals, and maybe even write them down by making a communication dictionary or a signal inventory. So all of that is part of getting prepared. If you're working with a family, this may just be a discussion. It may be looking at a particular routine and talking with the family in a coaching moment in the session to help them think through, well, when we're doing this together, when you and your child are doing this together, what are the ways in which they're already communicating with you? How does the child let you know that they want you to do that again? How do they let you know when they're done with it, or when they want you to do it differently? So very first step, knowing that child. And then, of course, we also have to know the tools. And in early intervention, this might mean that you have a system already in place that you're using with the family or trying out with the family. Maybe that's a light tech system, like a communication board or communication book, or it may be a high-tech device that you're trying out. But it's very difficult to teach if you don't know what's available on the system. And so whatever you're using, even if it's multiple different tools, which we'll talk about a lot today, you want to make sure that you and the family know where the words are. And so you might spend some time actually encouraging the family early on in your coaching program to get familiar with the technology. That might mean making lots of duplicates of that light tech device or the light tech communication book or board, and encouraging the parents to have an AAC date night where they talk to each other using some of the keywords on that board that you've highlighted as perhaps some good starting points. Or it might mean that during some of your coaching sessions, you do a little role play where you take an activity and you role play together with the parent. How would we find the words that we need to really highlight in this activity? So as we move through today, we're going to talk a lot more about how to identify the words, match them with the activities, adapt the interaction, and all of that. And it may seem like a little bit of a backwards process that perhaps you'll need to go through all of that and make your plan for what you're going to teach and model, and then go back and make sure that you get the family prepared by helping them practice both with the child present, but also away from the child, so that they have some time and energy to use their cognitive effort to really locate some of the words that they're going to be teaching. So very first step in that create AAC Go Set Go model is prepare, and we're going to know the child and get to know the tools. Next on the slide here, you see we've got this idea of create and support as next in our framework. And so here we're really thinking about how are we going to help families identify what is motivating for the child. This is going to be easier for some families, but what is motivating for the child, and also what is motivating for them to do together? So here, the idea is joy. We want to start in our coaching with anything that brings that child and family joy. That might not be a request for a snack. The child may enjoy snacks, but they may not be truly joyful. And so for some kids, the source of joy is going to be very obvious to mom and dad. They're going to know how much he loves to chase or swing in the blanket or do tickle games or do, airplane with dad through the room, through the house. But you really want to start with helping families identify several different routines or activities that are truly joyful. And we're going to talk in a little while about how we also need to make sure those activities are conducive to language learning in their structure, in their predictable structure. If you're concerned that you're having a hard time with a particular family identifying what is joyful for a child, and some little ones who are still learning how to share attention and how to regulate their sensory and emotional states may have very limited interests, and it can be difficult for us as providers and also for families to really find something that's motivating and joyful for that child. On the resource pages that I've linked at the end of the presentation on the accessible website, you'll find something called a motivations and joy survey, which is really just another way to systematize or provide a framework for you to think about how you can talk with families to identify more joyful routines. And so that checklist really goes through the sensory systems. For example, if you have a child who really likes to flip through videos, it could be quite hard for you and the family to come up with how to make that really powerful language learning routine. But you might be able to take that sensory property that this child loves and brainstorm together using the survey tool that I suggested, or any sort of interviewing that you can do together around, well, how else could we create what seems to be very joyful about this flipping, this visual stimulation? Are there other ways that we could create a more socially interactive version of this same sensory experience? So pop on over and check out that resource if you're really struggling with a particular child or family to come up with that joyful routine. But at the very core here, we're going to make sure that we're integrating in our home program several routines and activities that we know are really a source of joy for the family and for the child. Now we can identify these routines that are already happening with some of the examples I just provided, swinging in the blanket or, pushing in the swing, um, spinning around, playing airplane, whatever those activities are. We can also create some of these. And so this may be where for example, that a child likes to have a tickle game. And that's something that the family does often together. But you want to expand on that and create some other variations of a routine that maybe provides a similar joy. And so that is where you might kind of differentiate the identify something that's already happening versus how do we create new routines by expanding on this interest that this child has. And so, as I just mentioned before, in thinking about the child who likes to flip the screen, expanding and creating a new routine would be one way to add to that inventory and make sure that there's more opportunities throughout the day then to talk and learn together. Another way with the tickles might be that you change tickles into some other sensation. So maybe you help the family think about, well, can we do a tickle game? And also, how about a squeezes game? Can we expand on that interaction and make a little bit different so that we have different things to talk about and more opportunities to learn words? All right, another part of create and support is we really need to make sure that we're identifying the words that match the child's signals. So we got to know that child, the family gets to know what they're already communicating and how. And in the previous talk I mentioned earlier this month, we talked a little bit about how we could use a communication dictionary and an AAC word map to kind of marry the signal and the word. So how do we help that matching of meaning by thinking of words within a routine that's joyful that match what that child is interested in communicating already? And so that's part of our support and our create is we're really thinking about, okay, in this activity with these things that this child loves, here are the words that we really think we want to focus on. We're going to talk in a little while about how we're going to use some partner strategies to really integrate those words into that routine with that family. And then the last piece of that create and support is adapt. And we're going to talk at length in the next few slides about how we might think and work with our team members to adapt environments, especially for kids that are a little bit more physically involved or have vision differences. And then also we're going to talk about how we can help parents adapt their style in order to lend itself more to building language with AAC tools within these everyday activities. This last bullet here, inspire, is that rounding out of the home program framework. And it really is what you probably have been aware of as you've moved through different AAC trainings, this idea that we want to make sure we're inspiring kids to play with AAC, to listen to models, to engage with us as we model language in this way, but we don't require the use of the tool. And this can be really difficult for families. It's hard when you're learning something new as a parent to understand, what am I supposed to be focusing on here? What is my child supposed to be doing in order for me to know that how we're working together is actually making a difference? And so in this part of the home program, as you get to know the interactions between the family and the child, and you get to know how the child responds to some of the strategies and tools we're going to talk about as we move forward, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how to give the family a focus. So that they don't fall into that trap of requiring the child to use the system and then breaking down that interaction. We know these little guys under the age of 5, especially with significant disabilities, are going to be pretty turned off by the idea of being required to do much of anything. And so we want to make sure we give that family a focus. One of the focuses I love to give to families early in the process is to make sure that the child just keeps interacting. And so the mother or father may be concentrating on learning how to model on AAC, and that may be a skill that they're trying to increase in their frequency and in their success. But the child is just taking turns of any kind using any communication signal. And so I may be very explicit in my home program about, here's what you want to make sure you're doing, parent, and then here is what we want to see happening in the child. And that way, if we spell it out, we can hopefully empower the family to recognize that we're moving in a stepwise manner toward more and more use of the AAC over time. But that early on, it's like 98.9% modeling and a very small sliver of use. I'm gonna pop back over here, check the questions. So Elizabeth had a question I think is really appropriate to touch on here. She asks, can you give an example of something that would provide a similar visual stimulation experience to flipping through a video on YouTube? Yes. And I would like to open the floor in the chat as well. I'm sure that at least one of you in the room has had a child who likes to do this. What do you think the child is finding rewarding when they're flipping through the screens of the YouTube video? Sensory regulation is one of the chat responses. What else? Sometimes kids do this for regulation for sure. Feedback, visual and auditory input, visual stimulation, instant gratification, independence, control, choice. So, taking these ideas in mind, Elizabeth, you might be able to think of some other activities that give some of these needs, right? So, if it's control and choice, then maybe I want to create an activity, for example, where the child can control what happens to me. So one of the things we'll talk about in a minute in our slides is the work of Amy Starble at the University of Vermont. She has an approach called Any Word Works, where she creates AAC tools that could be light tech or mid tech that have kind of errorless responses on them. So one of my favorite things to do is action words, whether it's on a system that the child's already using and I open up that action word folder, or I create a communication board that's all actions related to a kitchen play activity. And as we kind of thumb through and push those buttons or touch those cells, then some really powerful and engaging adult, maybe mom or dad, or maybe even big brother or big sister, is going to do those actions and offer that child some way to control an activity that has fast moving, changing action that's probably silly and socially engaging, but there's no wrong answer. So it isn't like we're looking for a specific word. We're just going to touch a word and we're going to make things happen in the environment. So that's one example of how we might give control. Another example, if it's visual stimulation, movement is usually going to create the same thing that visual stimulation on a screen creates. And so this might be a child that I want to put in an office chair and push around the house or spin in the office chair in different directions. Or maybe we want to take different objects and we want to launch them so that we can watch them fly. But we're going to integrate that into like a ready, set, go routine where we have a little bit of a social ritual to it. There's some language, there's interaction, which is really key. We don't want to be down here on the screen when we could be up here with a person, but we're still moving quickly. We're providing that visual stimulation and we're giving that child agency to make something happen. Does anybody else have ideas of different games that you might use? Clap together. We've got a couple in there. Flipping pages through an electronic book. I think I would encourage you that when you're little and you're learning about your body and about the world, that a certain degree of stimulatory activities like this is appropriate. I think where it starts to feel inappropriate is usually when the child becomes self-absorbed. And so the challenge then for us and for parents is how we can use ourselves as an extension of this activity to engage with the child and what they love to do. And that goes beyond the scope of what we can talk about today. But if anybody's struggling with this, with some of the kids that they're working with, these stimulatory activities that kind of lock you out or lock parents out, I highly suggest DIR trainings of any kind are really helpful for this. And there may be some other ideas from your colleagues in the chat of how to get more strategies for these types of kids. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on from the chat, but keep your ideas coming. Somebody had asked what the name of the survey was that I mentioned, so I'm going to type it as I talk. It's the Motivations and Joys Survey. And you can get that on my website, which I put there in the chats. All right. So let's go back. Then we're going to move on from this framework and dive in a little bit to starting to design, right? So this idea of engineering. I know we're not all engineers in here, but we're thinking about this concept of engineering is really about planning ahead and helping families plan ahead. Although AAC really should be as naturalistic as possible, it's not realistic to think that if you don't make a plan and you don't have a purpose or an intention behind what you're doing, that it's going to stick the way that you want it to. And so we're hopefully going to take that naturalistic umbrella and kind of narrow in a little bit on how do we actually be intentional within our naturalistic approach. So here I'm using another framework. I love my frameworks, as you can tell. Apt for AAC, and as you know, the word apt is, it means we have the tendency to do something. When you're apt, you're more likely, or you have the tendency to do something. And so the next section of our talk, we're going to talk about how we can help families, how we can set them up to be more apt to model AAC. And we're going to use a couple different sections of engineering to do this. But before we go further into each one of these sections, I just want to talk through a little bit more about this idea of caught and taught. I don't know if anybody in the room has heard that phrasing before, of caught and taught. But you know, a lot of what we do in AAC is, like I said before, that naturalistic intervention, especially in early intervention. And we know how important it is to model. We've been fed that for many years now as SLPs and other professionals. But sometimes what we model might be missed, right? And I think that if you've ever tried to model with a 2-year-old who's still learning how to engage and regulate and is running all over their living room, getting into everything, you can probably relate to feeling this way, that I'm modeling and I'm modeling AAC until I'm blue in the face, but some of my models are getting missed. Some of them are definitely going to be caught by natural chance, especially when you get that glimmer in the child's eye and you catch the right word at the right moment and they're able to watch you and watch the AAC system. Some of them are going to be caught for sure. But then sometimes we also need to be a little bit more intentional and actually teach the word, the concept, or the skill that we are working on. And so I think today, we're going to focus a lot on this idea of using naturalistic opportunities where we aren't going to really create contrived activities with families because it's not usually what we do in early intervention. It's not like what we might do in a school setting where we've got that core word of the week and we're sitting down at the classroom, circle timetable, and we're going through our story and our song and everything kind of matches and jives in the theme. It's not usually what we do in early intervention. But we might model in a way that is specific to teach. And so we'll talk through that as we get through our partner strategies. All right, so as we move through the next few slides, then we're going to talk through this APT framework, and we're going to think about activities, places and spaces, and tools as the areas that we're going to engineer with families to create those immersive environments that we talked about at the start of our session. So the first one up is activities. We've already talked about how important it is to know what the child loves. We've talked through some ways, even in the chat here, that we could adjust and extend on something that the child loves that maybe isn't as interactive as we would like it to be. But let's talk a little bit more about this idea of how activities make families more apt to model AAC. Just going to move some of my windows around here. So here on the side, you can see I've got a little graphic on the right-hand side, person-centered versus AAC-centered, and it kind of speaks a little bit to what I just mentioned with that idea of contrived activities. We don't normally go into an early intervention setting saying, I really want to teach this child the word go. What activities can I make the family do that would lend themselves well to go, right? That would be AAC-centered. That would be, I want to teach this AAC tool, and so I'm going to modify the family lifestyle to fit it into this, this agenda that I have. Instead, what we want to do, of course, as providers, is meet the family where they are in everything that we do, and that includes AAC. And so we want to be a lot more family or person-centered and thinking about how do we take what the family is already doing and either integrate naturally the AAC targets that are coming up from that activity, or do a little bit of adaptation to our style or to the activity to lend itself to model these particular words and concepts that we have in mind. The first thing I like to do here when I'm thinking about engineering with families, firstly, though, is I really like to think about the difference between routines and activities. And really what we focus on mostly with families is this idea of routines. Routines, of course, are things that are happening often. They're happening every day, sometimes many times a day. Activities I see as being more specific and isolated. They're like special events. They're things we do some of the time. And that's going to differ depending on the family. But one example might be holidays, right? So holidays are coming up, but they're only going to be here for the time that they're here. And so if I'm thinking about starting in with a family and helping them integrate AAC into their life, I'm probably not going to focus in on activities until they're a little bit more well on their way and doing it in everyday routines. And so this is just kind of splitting hairs, but thinking about how do we establish routines that are going to happen frequently? Those are the main activities that we want. And routines-based intervention, I don't know how many of you have used this, but I did include a template towards the end of the presentation today that walks you through how to think about routines-based intervention with AAC in mind. We'll touch on some of the principles as we move through, but that handout could be a great place to get a little bit more structure and background to that idea. So the main thing about routines that we know makes them so powerful for teaching language is really that they're predictable, right? So they have a beginning, middle, and end. They're also something, as I said before, that happens often. They happen throughout the day, maybe many times a day. As we said before, they have to be motivating. And so we're probably not going to put toileting routines into our home program, even if the family is really eager to toilet train their child. It may be something that's on the back burner. But when we're thinking about these things, we really want to take those considerations and also think about um, where in this family's life might language really play a role? Where can this child have more agency? Where can they not only have agency through requesting, but also through sharing their opinions, telling mom and dad what to do, bossing big brother around, helping to manage the house or the family? Maybe they want to help make a shopping list, or they want to help decide what they're going to buy, grandma for her birthday. So even when kids are little at this age, we want to think about activities and routines beyond just requesting, really thinking about how that child could have some agency in that routine if they were provided access to more language. We also want to think about with families, what are they saying during this particular activity? And how do we help them adapt what they're saying and how they're saying it so that they can be a little bit more predictable and supportive in the child learning the language that matches this routine? When we talk about the handout on people play, I'll go into that a little bit more. And then, as I said before in our last talk from earlier this month, you have to match the words to what the child's already saying, but sometimes the words are not as important as the functions that the child is trying to communicate in a given routine. And so you may coach families through not necessarily what's the word here, but what is the pragmatic function, right? So, for example, during that tickles routine we talked about earlier today, um, the word can be many different words, but what is the function of the tickles? And I'm going to take a breather here and go back to the chat. What could be some communication functions that would pop up in a tickles routine for some of the kids that you work with? Requesting is first in line. Absolutely, Elizabeth. Engaging other people, recurrence or repetition, sharing fun, stopping something, commenting, initiating a social interaction. Yes, absolutely. And so we know that pre-linguistic communication foundations are really going to help AAC be successful in the long run. And so part of our work as EI providers is helping families recognize that although it's really valuable and important for children to ask for things, we also have to teach them ways to socially communicate even before they have words for it. And so I might take an activity or a routine that a family identifies like tickle and really coach them through, okay, what are the signals that the child is saying? What do we think those means and functions? When he touches my hand and puts it on his stomach, he wants me to tickle. So there we go. Pulls hand over, it's a request. When he looks at me after I stop tickling, that means that he is telling me he liked it. And so we put there a gaze and a smile, and then the function is I'm commenting that I like something. When he starts to stiffen his body, If I'm tickling a little bit too rough, that means that he wants me to do it differently, or he wants me to stop tickling. And so we can put that in means and functions as when I stiffen my body, that means I want you to stop or change it up. And so as we walk through this activity, we're definitely having some functions that are coming to mind. And then what I like to do is help families really identify the words that match those functions. And it might not be the same word every time, right? How could you how could you request tickles in a tickle routine? Give me some words that you could use. More is definitely the first one that comes to most minds, but one works go again, tickle, do it, like it, play. Yeah, so you can see you don't want to pigeonhole people into one word when they could use lots of words as long as they know what the function is. And it really helps keep that conversation a lot more nuanced and a lot more flexible when we help families understand you don't have to be a robot and say more over and over again. What you're trying to do is recognize that function that the child is trying to achieve and find one of the words that we've put on our word map or phrases that we can use to model and match meaning to that signal. All right, I think that's all I wanted to say here. Let's put this away. Let's move on. All right. So now let's go to this idea. Oh, I have a little bit more on activities here. I just had some activity tips. I already mentioned you can use a routines-based intervention approach. I offered you a link to a handout. It's here in the teal box, the image. If you click on that, you'll see what I mean by that. The routines-based intervention template also has a column on it to really get you thinking about how to coach families on what they say during a particular routine. And again, they don't have to be super robotic, but we all know that predictable language helps kids understand what to expect. And it also helps them bring and recruit that language back up when they're ready to express. We already talked about making a word map, which I discussed in the previous training, but I linked a template for you here as well. Um, and then I mentioned Amy Starble's work on Any Word Works, which I'm calling here Play with Words. So one of the ways that you could bring language into an activity is to have a communication support that's got words that really don't have a wrong answer. And so here on your screen, I have an example of how you can use a funny people play dynamic during a kitchen themed activity. So child may not be pretending with their kitchen toys yet, but they're learning. They may not really have ways to request anything or motivation to do that in a kitchen play. But if all of a sudden you start babbling through some of these words together and mom or dad belches like a truck driver, right? They go "Bleh," or they do a huge lick of whatever kitchen play items are available. Then all of a sudden you've added a sensory property to a very pretend oriented game that may make that young child who's still learning to attend and regulate a lot more interested in not only interacting in that activity, but also in communicating with some of these new words that make fun things happen with their grown up. And then the other piece here, that people play handout, you should have it with your slides for today, but AbleNet's also going to make a fancier version of it and put it up on their website. But it goes through what the Hannon folks over at Hannon, I'm sure some of you in the room have been Hannon trained, would call people games. And they have their whole We Make Play Rock series. That's where this people play idea comes from. It's not my idea. It's an adaptation of the strategies that I use and love from Hannon, but with an AAC spin. And really, people play can be a very powerful tool for families who are struggling to engage their children in back and forth interaction because it takes those toys out of the way and it really helps the dynamic be more of a dyad. And then when you have an AAC device come into it, it complicates it a little bit, but not as much as if I was looking at the AAC device and my mom and dad, and also the toy that's happening. All right. So moving on then, for the sake of time, the second piece of our APT framework here is thinking about how to plan ahead for places and spaces. And remembering that there's different AAC tools that may be appropriate depending on the environment that the child is in and also the position that they're in. And so when we're coaching families through this idea of thinking about their home and the places where these activities and routines happen, We want to help them, especially for kids with physical needs, help them think about what do we need to do to this space in order for this child to be able to see me, partner, to hear me, to see the AAC system, and also to touch or activate in whatever way that we have decided may be a good way to try. So this might mean that you've got to do some problem solving together as you're coaching from the outside. You've got this routine running. It's a tickles routine. Maybe the child is laying on the floor. If this child has physical differences or vision differences, we may have to use some tools like pillows or props or binders or cookbook holders, something to make that AAC support position so that that child can see it while the parent is modeling it and also be in that space of the interaction. It goes beyond the scope of today's training to talk about all the ways in which you might adjust places and spaces, but we just want to make sure that it's on your radar and that you're talking with your OT and PT and vision colleagues on your team so that together you can really start to problem solve how to make that place and that space more accessible for the child with different needs. We also want to think here about when we're activities that don't lend themselves well to technology, how do we make sure we adapt our tools so that language can be available? And I think the biggest example that comes to mind is water, right? So if we're swimming or splashing or playing in a water table, do we need to adjust our technology even in order to make it a little bit safer and more versatile in this activity within this position in the space that we're in? All right. And, when we're thinking about adapting, we not only want to think about adapting for position and for vision so that children with physical needs can participate better, we also want to think about our kids who have individual differences in their attention. And we help families create less distracting environments so that they're setting themselves up for success when they start to model. Maybe that's coaching them to do some decluttering of the play space. Maybe it's putting some high contrast material down, like a big dark sheet, so that when we're playing, we've got no visual distractions or limited visual distractions. Maybe it's as simple as suggesting that you turn the TV off when you come in for session or when the family sits down to try to practice and play a game together. I'm guilty of this. I walk into a lot of homes on a weekly basis where the TV is on, and I don't always tell them to turn it off, and I should because you guys know how hard it is for you and I to pay attention when we've got a screen going on in front of us, and so our little guys also need support in that area. So thinking about distraction and attention, and then also we want to adapt our places and spaces for safety. And here I'm not talking about necessarily physical safety, but we have a lot of kids in our early intervention arena that are maybe coming to us with some different sensory profiles. They might be easily startled. They may be dysregulated by the presence of certain sensations. And so, for example, I have a very barky dog who's on a hair trigger. And every time he barks, he startles my youngest child. And so if I was sitting down to do some learning, I'm going to put my dog in a space that doesn't startle my child because once he's in that fight or flight mode, it is very difficult to get him to take pleasure and to engage in an activity with me. And so think about sensory safety and how you can help families identify the things that make a child feel a little bit overwhelmed or unsafe in a space. And as we talk about partner strategies, we're going to carry this idea into that because sometimes the way in which we interact with children can also make them feel sensory unsafe. And it can shut our interactions down. And it necessarily isn't the AAC maybe that's doing it, but it's the way that we haven't matched our interaction style to what the child needs. All right, I'm going to go through a couple more slides and then I'll check the Q&A again. But I see we're backing up on time, so I don't want to miss anything. And the next piece on our app framework is tools. And so we've talked about routines and activities and how we're going to identify those and think about the words and the functions that match them. We're going to help our families do that. We also talk about places and spaces and adapting for that. Here we're going to talk about the actual tools. And my main point from today is really to encourage you to build multimodal AAC systems for families at this age. It is not required that you land on one tool and you only use that tool and you're going to live and die on that tool. We really want to use this early intervention time to explore lots of different tools, so multimodal ways of making AAC accessible in the home. And in our last talk from earlier this month, I gave a ton of resources for printable tools, so light tech tools, and also some links to some mid-tech tools that may be cost effective to bring into the family's home. And at the end of the talk, if we have time, I'm going to take you to my favorite Instagram profile to follow that has a ton of different ways to show you how to integrate multimodal AEC into different environments. But the main thing here is we want to make tools available because we know when they're available, they're more likely to be modeled on. So having a visual reminder to model is helpful to families, especially in the space where the activity happens. And so we're going to talk about this idea of embedding tools so that we can have them at hand. But before we go into that, I want to talk about a few more ways that you can help families have language available on their AAC systems, even when it's not maybe embedded in the actual space. So one of the things I love to do is whatever I'm using, especially if it's a core-based system or something that's going to kind of transfer across settings or routines, is to make a way for that to be carried hands-free. So if you've got a communication board, you might put it on a binder or on a piece of cardboard, put a couple holes in it with some duct tape to reinforce it, and pop a shoulder strap on it. And I actually have an example of something. You might do that. So this is an example of making a light tech system carryable, right? It's a simple lunchbox shoulder strap. We've got some duct tape, and this is actually a flexible cutting board that I bought off the dollar store. I think it was like a pack of 5 for $1. And so you've got your communication board on a steady backing with a shoulder strap that the family can carry around so that it's available no matter where they go. So carrying is one way. You can also make duplicates, lots and lots of printouts of the different boards you decide to use with the family. And you want to put those all over the house. You might even put some high-tech versions of them, right? You might take a screenshot so that mom has that, activity board related to tickle time on her phone. You can take a quick screenshot, have it on her phone. You might have it on the tablet. You might also have it printed up and put in the living room. So lots of ways to make duplicates. Don't just give families one board. It's just paper, right? Let's give them a lot. Let's make sure it's everywhere we think that this communication may happen. And if you're using a high-tech tool, that might also mean that you're making backups. And so if you're using a communication app with a family, you might want to make sure that you got it on the child's tablet, but also on mom and dad's cell phone. And most of the apps that you can download from the App Store allow family sharing, and the family can have them on up to 5 devices. And so why not put it on a phone? The child might not be able to use it on the phone, but at least it's available. So if mom and dad see a moment that they want to harness for learning, you can pull that up if the tablet is not available. You can also make printable versions of all of the high-tech apps available usually right now. I offered a lot of resources from my last talk, so pop on over to that if you want to take advantage of some of those. But having lots of backups, lots of duplicates, carrying your systems, and then, as I mentioned before, embedding the tools, which is what we'll talk about next. So I'm going to take a moment here, just pop over to the Q&A before we dive into the last section of the talk. Kristen's asking, what would be the minimum or maximum target action words when modeling in an activity? The example you showed had 12 words. So that's a great question, Kristen. And I would say when I'm trying to figure out how many words to have available for a child in we call an array, I'm not really thinking about an arbitrary number. I'm thinking about what is the smallest picture that that child can touch and see. So you're going to want to do a little bit of poking around. One of the quickest litmus tests for this is if the child can open mom's cell phone and thumb through YouTube and find the play button. You don't have to worry about how many pictures you put on one screen. They're probably going to be good to go with 12, 20 or more. But you want to be reasonable. Some kids get overly distracted by a lot of visual complexity. So what I like to do is start big, and then I keep my file saved. And if I find that the child is just not watching or engaged with the array big, and I know they can see and touch the button, but it might just be too complex for them to pay attention to, then I might go back into my board and I might delete a couple of the pictures and make them blank and narrow that down, but keep those boxes tiny because I know that the child can touch and see something that's about that big. So there's a lot of different strategies for doing what we would call an access screening. But I think most of our kids who are navigating phones are usually not going to be the ones you worry about. It's the ones that might need alternative access where we've got to spend more time with our team figuring out what is the smallest button in the largest array that this child can touch and see. And then let's make some boards and try that out. Okay. And Amber, the PDF of the Ready, Set, Go is if you open your handout and you click on that image on the slide, you'll get to the website with the PDF. All right, and then the last question here, Valerie is asking, is there a resource for low-tech examples of how you adapted a communication board for travel using a cutting board and a lunchbox strap with the tape? I don't think there is, Valerie, but if you want to reach out to me, I can provide you with instructions for that. It's very, very easy. And there's probably even better ways to do it. All right. Last question here. Kessia is asking, how young would you start with AAC? And I don't know that we've got a silver bullet answer, but what I like to consider in my own practice philosophy and what the research has told us is if the child is of a talking age and they're not speaking, so 13 to 14 months, we need to be thinking about some form of AAC technology and strategy in their program. And this is especially true for children who have diagnoses that put them at risk for longer term speech and language delays or disorders. So any child with autism or risk for autism, flags for autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, any genetic conditions. These are the kids that we really want to make sure that we're thinking about very early as 13 to 14 months. If they're not talking by 18 months, I would be in there thinking about AAC tools and strategies. All right, I'm going to pop away from questions just for the sake of time. We've got 2 minutes, and I want to make sure that I show you some of the ways in which embedding AAC tools could be really helpful to families. So here I've just got a mock-up of a home, and you can see I've got various supports kind of speckled around. Embedding language where the action actually happens is the best way to really get people modeling it when the child goes to that area to make that routine happen. So here on the door, we've got a little door hanger, which is kind of like the ones you get room service in hotels, but you can actually buy them and actually put things inside of them on, I believe it's Amazon and a couple other marketing websites. And so here, this one's just got some words related to going outside. So it's an activity-based communication board that's got language that the child may be able to use in order to create some agency in the activity of going outside. Down here by the beanbag chair, we've got a box of some of my favorite predictable preschool books and a little binder of communication boards that have activity-based or book-based language related specifically to each one of those stories. So I might create some simple book boards that go along with this child's favorite books, create a little binder of the boards, or even tuck the boards with some Velcro into the inside of the book. So when they go to read together, they just have to push that board out, place it next to them, read, and mom and dad can comment as they're reading through the book by modeling on AAC. So lots of different ways you can see to embed, but the point here is we want to use language in the space that it happens, and we want to use a variety of tools that lend themselves best to that particular activity. So I'm going to move a little more quickly into the kitchen slide here to just bring some mid-tech supports to mind. So here we've got, maybe the child likes to participate in helping to take care of the dog. This is a voice output switch that calls the dog over when it's time to feed the dog. And so maybe the child helps with pouring the food or pouring the water. And then they get some agency in that activity by pushing that voice output switch to call their dog over when it's time to eat. Here we also can see you can use some of these light text supports up in the kitchen. So maybe we've got a choice board for snacks here on the refrigerator, and maybe another one on the pantry for dry snacks. We might have a different type of communication board here on the counter that helps the child communicate while they're eating the snack. And maybe we put that on a placemat, for example, so that when they sit down at the counter to have their snack, words related to that mealtime routine are right there on the placemat. All right. So as we wrap up, and we are going to probably go about 5 to 10 minutes over for those who want to stick around. We're going to end here with talking briefly about some partner strategies. We've kind of talked along the way about helping families to know what to focus on early on in the AAC process, but we also need to help them understand how to address or adjust their interaction style in order to promote more turn taking from that child and also more engagement in the AAC modeling. And so the very first strategy that I always encourage families to do if they are not doing it already is to just add more affect to what they're doing with that child. So if anyone's been DIR trained in the room, you'll know this very well. This is where you really just make yourself super, super fun, but also you have to keep in mind that child's sensory profile. Some kids will need us to upregulate them because they need a little bit more oomph and excitement in order to engage. Other kids are going to get very overwhelmed or overstimulated by that energy. And so we're going to help families realize how their interaction strategy fits with their child's preferences and needs, and then help them adjust that because that is so key to the child engaging with AAC models. They have to be able to remain engaged and motivated in the activity. So start here, make those really flat families a little bit more energetic when the child needs it, and help to really downregulate those loud or maybe intrusive, overly demanding or quick paced families so that they can downregulate that child's energy and keep them very engaged. I also find that affect works really, really well when I'm trying to drag out language models. And so I might pull my communication board into the space between me and the child and really encourage with my affect some attention to that model, right? So it's ready, set, and I might gasp and create a very big expression as I slowly point to that word. So I'm really showing them this is the word I'm about to say to make this fun thing happen. So using that energy can really draw in their visual attention. The second strategy here, watch, wait, and wonder, is kind of like Hannon's observe, wait, and listen. It's the same idea, remembering that we need to help our families know that every AAC model starts with the child's signal. We need to know what that child's already saying in order to know what we should expand on. So we're going to remind our families during those activities, we want to always be watching that child, waiting for them to initiate. Kids are always doing something, even if they're not communicating directly to their parent, they're making a move, they're doing something during an activity, and that family needs to be coached to recognize that as intentional and to respond to it in a way that keeps the interaction going. We also want to coach families that all communication counts. So even if the child doesn't use a word, use a gesture, use a sign, if they're doing anything, let's try to figure out what it means in this activity. Let's name it with our models, show it on the device as we do it, and take our turn in that way to expand and let the child know, I recognize that you did something. I saw you just kicked your foot. You want me to give you more tickles, right? So help your families understand how to watch for all those communication bids because they're going to be great springboards for words. And then that last strategy is really all about modeling. And I like to think about two types of modeling when I coach families. The first one is modeling to match. And so I want to keep things very simple. What is the one word that best fits what this child is communicating to us? Maybe it's tickles, maybe it's more. Let's contingently match what we say and what we show on the AAC tool directly to what that child is signaling to us. And then the second strategy I like to use is add to, and that's just another way of talking about aided language stimulation, where we're using that idea of expanding on what's going on, expanding on what the child's already saying. And so in that tickles exchange, I might use a model to match and encourage that family to say, oh, I see you kicking your leg. Let's do more tickles. But then I might have them expand, add to with their models. And so I might say, okay, in the next turn, before you tickle, I want you to say, ready, go. And then we're going to add to that idea by having the word go in there for tickles or tickle or whatever you decide you want to match to it. All right, so with that, I want to just give you a bonus slide here that kind of talks about how that modeling circle might look. This is a great thing to role play and practice on your own, and then to help families understand. Modeling always starts with a motivating activity, and it starts with the child initiating. So families really should be prioritizing that, especially early on. If it's the only strategy they do, encourage them to model based on what the child is already doing. And this Powers Play model could be helpful for that. There's a lot of resources here for you on these final slides, including some of the ones I mentioned throughout the training. I also want to let you know that we're having a conference at Accessible. It's a free live conference, all devoted to AAC and early intervention. So stop by. It's in February on the 15th and the 16th. It's all online. If you attend live, it's completely free. And we usually have between 20 and 25 live presentations on various topics related to early intervention for children with complex communication needs. I'm going to pop over to the Q&A section now and just see if we can get to any more of the questions. And remember, you don't have to stay. We are over time, so feel free to pop out when you want to. Megan is asking here, do you have a recommendation of companies that have the best AAC higher tech devices? Great question, Megan. I don't have a recommendation, but I can give you several that I have had a lot of success working with. AbleNet is one of them. I love AbleNet for many of my kids who are direct selectors who use touch access. There's also Dynavox. Tobii Dynavox is another company. Prinky Romic and Sautillo are other companies. And all of these companies are going to offer access to what we call dedicated devices, which are devices that you can help families obtain that are specifically for communication, or apps, of course, that you can run on what's called an integrated device. So if a family already has technology at their home and you're looking to help them with communication apps that they want to load on that, all of the companies I just mentioned, except for AbleNet, which I believe only does dedicated devices, would have apps that would be worth trying. Judy asks, what system would you recommend to create these low-tech devices? So Judy, I wouldn't create anything from scratch before you go explore what's already available. So if you go to the website that I just gave you in the final slide, the Accessible website, we have a section on there where you can download free light tech communication boards, but I also have a link on there that gives you lots of curated resources for other free downloads from companies that have offered them. And then if you decide you want to use some of those as a model and make your own, you can use a lot of programs. You can use Canva, you can use BoardMaker, which is a program that you need to purchase. I've created boards on Google Slides. I created them on PowerPoint. Really, what you need is something that can create a series of boxes that you can put text and pictures in. All right, so I'm going to pause here. If there's any more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll aim to wrap up here in the next minute or two. Thanks for your patience as I went a little over time, but also thank you for joining me. I hope this was helpful. Don't hesitate to reach out. If you have questions or you can't find a resource that I mentioned, please reach out to me and I am more than happy to guide you to it.
Anna, there were a few questions that came through the chat.
Great, let me pop on over there.
Oh, I can read them to you. You'll be searching for one.
Okay.
Do you have any ideas for a child that is losing their vision completely? And this question came through when you were on your activity tips slide, if that gives you more context.
Yeah, so a child that's losing their vision completely, and I don't know if the person is still in the room who asked that question, but if you want to offer a little bit more context, are you looking for tips on play or tips on communication devices?
This question was from Elena, so we'll see if she comes back in the chat. While we're waiting, though, there was a question about handouts or evidence to show parents that AAC does not hinder the learning of verbal communication. Do you have any resources that would address that?
Yes, and somebody just popped a handout link to my last training, the Where Do I Start in AAC and Early Intervention. I created a resource list that's all filled with myth handouts. So there's research papers on there. There's handouts that are more parent friendly. AbleNet has a wonderful handout that I also included in that resource that's very parent friendly and talks about the most popular myths around AAC for little ones. So pop on over there, and I think you should be able to find it.
All right, and then the last one that I have is somebody asked if they missed the Instagram page that you had mentioned.
Yeah, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I'll pull it up really quick and just put it in the chat. I also just want to mention here, yes, lesson picks, which Nina mentioned. Love lesson picks for creating boards. It's a great tool. The Instagram, there's probably several of them, but my favorite for getting DIY and very easy to implement ideas is AAC for All, Mary Catherine Daly. And I'm just going to try to give you a link in the chat. But it's just @ AAC for All on Instagram. Mary Catherine works in preschool and school environments, but she is just a kind of a powerhouse when it comes to thinking about how to integrate AAC and adapted play ideas just to make the world more accessible in all ways for kids. So here is the link to her Instagram. Pardon my slowness. I have a ton of windows open on just one screen here. All right, did Elena make it back to us in the chat? If not, I will move through some of the Q&A on our Q&A tab and then try my best to answer Elena's question.
No, but she did. But Julie added to it that she had the same question, and she's working with an AAC user who has a degenerative condition.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend talking closely with your TVI or other vision specialist that's working with you. Obviously, if a child is expected to go completely blind or lose most of their vision acuity, we definitely want to be working on auditory scanning skills. Chances are, if they're accessing technology through technology for communication without any vision at all, they're going to need some auditory scanning abilities. And so auditory scanning, for those who aren't familiar, is can happen with a partner, like a person as a partner. And so that might be somebody scanning through choices verbally and waiting for a child to acknowledge yes or no. Or it can also occur on technology. And so all of our most robust devices have auditory cue scanning built into them. And so that would be something that you could start working on very early using a partner scan approach or using technology or using both. But I would say auditory scanning is probably go-to for children who are losing their vision. Someone's asking, how can I copy links in the chat? I don't know the answer to that. And just to build off the vision impairment, and I see somebody mentioned in the chat, if you have a child who's visually impaired and not losing their vision, you can certainly use some of the adaptations that are available on the technologies like Lamp Words for Life, and TD Snap has a high contrast, but you definitely don't want to throw all visually impaired kids into one bucket. So talk at length with your vision team. Some people with visual impairment need high contrast and color. Others need low complexity. So there isn't a one size fits all, but there's certainly a pool of strategies to pull from, many of which are available on some of the main market technologies that we have. All right, I'm going to pop back over for just another minute to the Q&A tab. I think there was a couple more questions there. So Elizabeth asked, when you are trialing different softwares, how many trials do you give it prior to making a decision? So a lot of that is going to be dependent on the insurance company or the payer, Elizabeth, that's going to pay for the technology that you're trialing. Some of them require trial of at least 3 tools, and there's some specifics on what those tools need to encompass in order to be considered a valid trial. As far as how long you need to trial, that usually depends also on the insurance. Some require 90-day trial, but I wouldn't continue to try a system with a family if after the first 2 days they're definitely not into it. And so use your judgment here, but give the family enough time, based on what you've learned about them in their learning process and other areas that you've worked together on. Some families need to get over the first hump, the week or so, that it's like overwhelming to try to integrate this new thing into their life. And so they may need more of that 3 or 4 week trial. Unfortunately, your technology companies are also going to dictate your trial if you're using loans because they don't always offer it for a long term. So there's a couple variables you'll have to weigh there, right? So what does the insurance require? What is the family going to have most benefit from as far as the length and the amount of options? And then what are my vendors who are offering the trial equipment? What are their regulations as far as how long I can keep the equipment? Someone's got a question about the assessment and how they assess the assessment, Jim, access the assessment.
Okay, I've just put that in there. I put the link in. It will, I'll post it in the chat as well again.
Yeah. All right. So it looks like that probably wraps up questions. I'm going to go ahead just for the sake of convenience, and I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well. So if anybody had a question they didn't get answered or a tool they would like help accessing, you can feel free to reach out to me directly through email.
All right. Thank you, Tanna, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us again today. For those of you who are still here, if you didn't get to see Tanna's presentation from a month ago, I highly recommend going back to view that as well, especially if you enjoyed today. If you would like to earn ASHA CEUs for today's session, please remember to complete the assessment. I'll put that link in the chat one more time. You'll be redirected to that page once we close out the session as well. You'll also receive a link to that assessment tomorrow. You can always email ableu@ablenetinc.com to request that or to check status on anything as well. On that assessment, you'll want to be sure to complete it at 80% or better, and we will have that open for 1 week. So you have 1 week to complete that. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Tanna.